Hi everybody, I just wanted to talk through a few examples from the Symbology challenge. Just to talk about the Symbology and answer some of the questions that you had. I don't have time to go through all 40, but I kind of picked some at random. So one of the things that I had started to address in this one is to get you to think about the intuition of color, and how color relates to the background, how your symbology relates to the background. And this type of symbology, this is called a sequential color palette or color scheme, where the colors increase in intensity one direction as the values increase. Now, increasing from white to red makes sense. Red is intuitively a very threatening or dangerous color. It's associated with heat, with dryness, danger, right? So that does make sense for something like CO2 emissions in this era of human-induced climate change. So this does make a lot of sense. Now, the graduated symbology and graduated color together is what we call dual encoding. You're encoding the same value twice, and it works effectively to just kind of drive your story home. It isn't always necessary, but it's kind of leveraging our ability to perceive things kind of pre-attentively. Cartographically, I think another thing I wanted to point out is making a north arrow black against dark gray and the scale bar white. This creates high contrast and says this is important, and it lets this sit into the background. And we've talked about this a little bit, that digital maps are considered north up unless the cartographer, very deliberately moves north away, and then you'd want to use a north arrow. So this is a nice way of providing the information without letting it take over. But coming back to the color, white against the dark gray is higher contrast. The red is closer in tone or shade, but the color is so much more vivid that works. It works, and it kind of allows all the symbology to stand out, but the large size and the red color kind of gives us that intuition that these are the higher values. So that's what we're looking for. How can you, draw your viewer's eye to the symbols that you want them to notice, and how can you use, what we kind of perceive before even thinking about it? How can we use those things that humans do to make reading the map as effective and efficient as possible? And I think this works well. Another thing for you guys to think about is some of you missed out on the fact that you have to change the field, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. This one I loved because it was a new symbol that they were able to apply a color ramp to as well. ArcPro has not done a great job of kind of creating this classified graduated color ramp, but I think this works pretty well to tell the story, and the symbols are awesome, really awesome. And some of you went further and pushed the significant digits here, and I think this works really well. This is really how this should be presented, with this kind of significant digits, really keeping it simple for a legend. If you want your audience to have specific information about these, you can provide that in a label or in a pop-up if it's an interactive map. But when we're mapping things like this, we're mapping for spatial distributions and looking for those kinds of visual patterns. So you don't necessarily need to provide that kind of information down here, but you certainly can if you want to. This one is very strikingly, kind of a dirty red on the white background. I asked you guys to kind of think about the context that you need in a base map. One of the things I think you need is a clear outline of the state boundary, and then some kind of geographic context, labeling of the cities and things like that. But this is also really nice and clean. The legend really speaks for itself. Yep, so I think this is another effective way. So this one is just a single kind of encoding, right? Just using graduated symbology. And I'm going to talk about the difference between graduated and proportional in just a second. Let me just kind of flick through a couple more of these. Yeah, so I think the way, and you guys need to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way y'all are doing this is setting up a graduated color and then changing the symbol size secondarily. That's how I've had to make this happen. Yeah, I think these all work pretty effectively because they're a unidirectional. They're kind of like this isn't monochromatic, this is yellow and green, but it's increasing in intensity. Now, again, the bigger symbols, are bigger. If they use a more vivid color, they're going to get our attention. But because the lighter colors are higher contrast against the base map, they don't get lost. So I think that is a nice way of balancing this out. One thing I was going to point out to this student, this is a great page layout where they went landscape instead of portrait, which is great. This space can be used, like they've done it here, where they've kind of composed in this negative space and then composed in this negative space. And I wonder, part of me wonders if you slid this up a little bit and maybe brought the scale bar in here, drop down the size of the north arrow, perhaps you could kind of use this space to create a left alignment here that would just kind of reinforce this as a column of information. And that might work well. But, this composition stuff in cartography, you can see that it is definitely something that can be learned. You guys are bringing really incredible maps every week. But there's a lot of nuance and a lot of effort that needs to go into it, a lot of attention to detail. And I think sometimes the best idea is to create a map and then share it and get some feedback, see how other people see things, and then you can kind of take or leave their suggestions as fits for you. Let's flick over to Arc Pro really quick. Here's the same data set. If I go into the symbology, there is, like I was saying, graduated symbols and proportional symbols. Technically, a graduated symbol is just going to have a min and a max size, which the user can adjust, and they're going to be classified using some kind of probably natural breaks. Here's the histogram that shows the distribution of this data set. But the most important thing to realize is when you symbolize a data, ArcGIS is going to default to the first numeric field it finds. And in this case, it's an ORIS code. And this ORIS code is just a random, ORIS code. Has nothing to do with the CO2. There are two CO2 fields. I don't care which one you use. It doesn't really matter. But this is the measured variable for this data set. You have to switch that over. The max should be around 16 million tons per whatever it was. And so again, here's your histogram. It's breaking it into natural breaks. I don't think this is, it says right here, natural breaks. You could change the classification scheme to something like equal interval or quantile. Quantile ensures that there's the same number of observations in each class. Natural breaks uses an algorithm that looks for breaks in the histogram and tries to cluster like values together. And if you change it from 5 classes to 4 to 3 to 7, whatever it is, it's gonna calculate and look for clusters of values within those class breaks. The geometric interval is really useful for, I think, normalized or a more normal distribution, not normalized data, a normal distribution. A defined interval and equal interval depend on whether or not you want to set a certain number of classes and then it divides the data up evenly, or if you want to have a data range where it's like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So standard deviation is going to take the mean of all your data and then plot like how far away from the mean emissions each one of the power plants is. For that one, you'll end up with a divergent color ramp with a neutral midpoint, increasing in intensity of color as you go away from the mean. So lots of different ways that you can show this data, but the most important thing is to get the correct value field for the symbology. Okay, so graduated symbol, it's just a min and max that you can set But here's the clinker. If you have a power plant that's emitting 91 tons per year, and then you have a power plant that's emitting 15.7 million tons per year, this symbol should technically be whatever that is, 50 times bigger, not 50 times, it would be something like, I don't know, 50,000 times bigger. The area of the symbol should be proportional to the value that it's representing. So graduated symbols are great because we can control this and make our map look good. If we switch this over to proportional symbol, technically, if I can get it to go, and again, switch it back to CO2. Technically, this symbol should be, I don't know, what is that? 100,000 times the size of this symbol, meaning you should be able to fit 100,000 of these in here. That's what a proportional symbol should be. It's tricky to work with, and I think the key as a cartographer is you have to be aware of that, and then you have to explain to your audience that the area of the circle does not reflect the proportional difference of the values that it's representing. It's going to try, and it should technically be correct. I use another software package called Tableau. It's only limited to proportional symbol, and it is, the areas are actually proportional to the data that they represent. ARC does not do a good job of holding that rule in effect. But again, it's tricky here if you want to go ahead and put in a color. It's going to allow you to do that as two separate. It'll show it here, but in the legend, I haven't figured out a way to make the legend behave. We can show it as two separate things. But in order to reflect it in the legend, I've had to manually do it. So if you guys have figured out a way to manually marry these two together, and the reason they keep them separate is, traditionally you'd be showing two different things to make it a true bivariate map. But for our purposes, we're encoding the same thing. I have found it easier to go the other way around and give it a graduated color, and then just go in and change the symbol sizes here. Like this. But then I end up getting rid of this thing because it's somehow proportional. It's not keeping the 0.7 outline width. So I would do it that way, but it's a little putsy. And it's also not proportional, so it's also technically not correct, which is, a bit of a bummer. Okay, so that's sort of this assignment in a nutshell, plus a whole lot more. If you guys have questions, please keep them coming. Oh, another question was, my example showed in the legend less than or equal to for the max value of each class. And the student asked, how did I do that? And I didn't. It used to be the default setting for an earlier version of ArcGIS Pro, and they did away with it and went back to these classes because this is more correct. It's confusing if you have class ranges where you have, less than or equal to 10,000, less than or equal to 100,000, less than or equal to 1,000,000. If you have a value of 100, it's technically in all those classes. And that just doesn't make sense. It's not a good way to show data. It makes for a clean but confusing legend. So technically having a range of values is the right way to go. And the key is to clean them up. If you can say something like, and this is the wrong value, I get that. If you could say something like, thousands of tons CO2 per year, then you could just have 4.2 or just even 4, right? And get rid of all these zeros, get rid of the significant digits, and really clean it up. That's the best way to handle that. Okay. Yeah, great questions, great observations, and some truly beautiful symbology. I saw people using 3D, rounding them, and using a graduated fill, to really give them some pop. Yeah, so just keep going.